The day Emma announced she was pregnant, my whole world shifted. It was early morning, and I was at the kitchen table going over some paperwork, savoring the last quiet moments before the day began. Emma burst into the room with a glow on her face that stopped me mid-sip of coffee. She looked happier than I'd seen her in months, practically radiating with excitement. "Michael, we're going to be parents," she said, her voice trembling with joy. I tried to mirror her expression, but something about it felt wrong. Not in her excitement. I wanted to feel it too, wanted to believe it was real. But there was a cold certainty gnawing at the back of my mind, one I couldn't ignore. I knew I hadn't been with her for a while, not in the way that brings new life into the world. And that little detail settled like a stone in my chest. "Are you sure?" I asked, hearing the words escape my mouth before I had the chance to filter the hesitation out of my tone. "Of course I'm sure," she laughed, brushing off the question as though it was absurd to even ask. "I'm 6, maybe 8 weeks along." Her smile grew wider, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. "I was going to wait a bit longer, but I couldn't keep it from you." The numbers didn't add up. In fact, they didn't even come close. We hadn't been together in almost 4 months, a strange thing for us, now that I thought about it. We'd always had a strong connection, one of the things I'd valued most about our relationship. I'd assumed her distance recently was just a passing phase, something to do with her stress, or maybe just one of those rough patches you hit after a few years together. But as I looked at her now, every small warning sign I'd ignored came back in sharper focus. I tried to push the doubts away, telling myself I was imagining things. After all, this was Emma, my wife, my partner. I'd built my life around her. I couldn't let a few inconsistencies rob me of the future we'd talked about since we met. But the questions were already there, digging in, refusing to let go. Later that night, as Emma slept peacefully beside me, I lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the pieces. There was no denying it. The dates didn't fit. If she was telling the truth, then I wasn't the father. The realization settled over me like a lead weight, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely helpless. The next few days were a blur. I tried to keep my mind busy, telling myself I just needed to let it go, trust her. But I found myself watching her more closely, noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. Her phone, for one thing, always in her hand, locked tightly when she wasn't looking at it. Little changes in her appearance, too. A new perfume, a bit of extra care with her makeup, clothes that seemed to accentuate her in ways that felt unfamiliar. Subtle things, barely noticeable, but all the more unsettling for it. Then there were the late nights. She'd started spending more time out, saying she was meeting friends or attending a book club she'd recently joined. At first, I didn't think much of it. I worked long hours myself, and I'd always believed in giving each other space. But something didn't sit right with her explanations. It was the way she answered, too quick, too rehearsed, like she'd practiced every word in her head before saying it out loud. And when she smiled, that bright, practiced smile, I began to feel like a stranger in my own home. I hadn't yet found anything concrete, nothing I could hold up as proof. And maybe I told myself I wouldn't. Maybe this was all in my head, a side effect of the long hours at the office, the pressure of a fast-moving career. I wanted that to be true. I wanted it so badly I could taste it. But each day, that little voice in the back of my mind grew louder, whispering that something was wrong, that things weren't as they seemed. And yet, I didn't say a word to Emma. I watched. I waited, hoping the feeling would pass, that I'd wake up one morning and see her the way I used to. But the more I watched, the more I saw. One evening, as I sat alone in our living room, I tried to remind myself of everything we'd built together. The countryside home we'd chosen, the late nights spent planning our future, the quiet moments when everything felt perfect. But the memories felt faded, like they belonged to another time. And when I looked over at Emma, who was scrolling through her phone with that same, slightly distant smile, I realized I didn't recognize her at all. Something had changed in her. Something deep. Something I hadn't wanted to see. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that whatever this was, it hadn't just started. It had been there, slowly creeping in, shifting her into someone I didn't know. In that moment, I made a decision. If there was something she was hiding, I would find it. Not because I wanted to hurt her, or even because I wanted to catch her in a lie, but because I needed to know the truth, no matter what that truth was. So I began watching closely, taking mental notes of every little thing. The phone call she took outside, the messages she answered with her back to me, the nervous laugh she gave when I asked where she'd been. I hadn't asked for this. I'd never been the suspicious type. But the pieces were falling into place, one by one, and I couldn't ignore the picture they were forming. The truth was there, hiding in plain sight. I just had to be willing to look. I'd always thought that trust was the foundation of any good marriage, a belief I'd held since the day Emma and I exchanged vows. We'd built our life on that foundation, or so I'd thought. But now, I was discovering just how fragile that trust really was. It took only a few days for cracks to appear, and once I'd let myself see them, I couldn't look away. It started with the late nights. For as long as I'd known her, Emma was always a homebody. She loved curling up with a book or watching old movies together. But now, she was constantly going out, saying she was meeting friends or networking at events I'd never heard her mention before. And every time I asked who she was meeting, she'd dodge the question, saying, "Oh, you wouldn't know them." One evening, after she left, I decided to check the calendar app on her computer. It wasn't something I'd ever thought of doing before. We trusted each other, after all. But tonight, with that nagging feeling growing in the back of my mind, I couldn't resist. I opened the app, scrolling through her recent events, looking for any hint of where she was going. But the calendar was nearly empty. She hadn't even listed the dinners and gatherings she'd been talking about, the ones she claimed were so important. For someone who used to plan every detail of her week, it was strange, like she'd suddenly decided to hide her life from me. And as I stared at that empty calendar, a cold realization settled in. She wasn't just keeping things from me. She was deliberately creating gaps, making sure I couldn't trace her movements. That night, when she returned home around midnight, I was sitting in the living room pretending to be engrossed in a book. She looked startled to see me still up. "Late night?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. She hesitated just a second too long. "Yeah, it ran longer than expected. A lot to catch up on." I watched her cross the room, her hand resting a little too protectively over her purse, which she set down on the table before slipping off her shoes. "Who all was there?" I asked, flipping a page to keep up appearances. "Oh, the usual crowd," she said, brushing the question off with that practiced ease I was starting to recognize. "You'd be bored stiff hearing about it." She said it with a smile, but I could see the tension behind it. There was a flash of something else in her eyes, a flicker of irritation, maybe even guilt. She quickly looked away, pretending to fuss with her shoes, and the conversation ended there. The next morning, when she was in the shower, I found myself staring at her purse where she'd left it on the kitchen counter. I told myself I was just grabbing my keys, that I had no intention of going through her things. But as I reached for my wallet, I saw a receipt peeking out of the bag, half hidden under her phone. Something in me shifted. I picked it up, feeling a strange combination of dread and anticipation. The receipt was from a restaurant downtown, one of those upscale places we'd visited only on special occasions. It was dated the night before and included 2 entrees, a bottle of wine, and dessert. I'd been to that restaurant with her before, and I knew she'd never order that much on her own. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. She hadn't been meeting the usual crowd. She'd been on a date, sitting across from someone else, laughing, drinking, eating, in a place I once thought of as ours. I felt a sickening mixture of anger and sadness as I stared at that receipt. I wanted to march upstairs, confront her, demand the truth. But instead, I folded the receipt, tucked it back in her purse, and went about my day as if nothing had happened. A confrontation would mean an end to this game, and I wasn't ready for that yet. If she was lying, if she was sneaking around, I needed more than a single piece of paper. I needed undeniable proof. So I started paying attention. Every time she mentioned meeting a friend or running an errand, I'd make a mental note. I began noticing how her stories changed each time she told them. Little inconsistencies she didn't think I'd catch. She'd say she was going to the gym, but her workout clothes were still in the closet, neatly folded, untouched. Or she'd say she was meeting her friend for coffee, but when I casually asked how it went, she'd struggled to remember what they talked about. The cracks were everywhere, each one widening the gap between us, until all I could see was a stranger in front of me. One night, just as I was leaving work, I got a text from an old friend of mine, Dave. We hadn't spoken in a while, but he'd always been the kind of friend who popped up just when I needed him. His message was short. Saw Emma at Murphy's last night. Thought you guys were out of town. Murphy's was a bar on the other side of town, the kind of place she'd never set foot in. I called him, keeping my voice light, pretending not to care, and asked him if he was sure. He laughed, saying he was positive it was her, that she'd been sitting with a man he didn't recognize, looking real cozy. After that call, there was no denying it anymore. It wasn't just suspicion, and it wasn't in my head. Emma was seeing someone else, maybe more than one someone. All the little signs had added up, each one a quiet betrayal, each one another weight on my shoulders. I hung up the phone, standing there in the empty parking lot, feeling the cold night air settle around me. I drove home, my mind reeling, wondering how I could confront her without letting on just how much I knew. But I didn't want an argument, a screaming match, or a quick explanation that would sweep all this under the rug. I wanted the truth, the real truth, the kind you can't twist or cover up, and I wanted her to know just how much she'd destroyed in the process. By the time I walked in the door, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Emma was in the kitchen, smiling that bright, brittle smile she'd perfected over these past few months, asking me how my day was, going on about her plans for the weekend. But I didn't answer, just nodded along, letting her think I was oblivious, letting her think she still had the upper hand. In that moment, as I watched her talk, I made a promise to myself. She wanted to lie, to keep secrets, to play games? Fine. I'd give her all the freedom she wanted. But I'd do it on my terms, in my own way. If she thought she could play me, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. I kept my distance, letting Emma think she'd managed to pull the wool over my eyes. But every time I looked at her, a cold sense of detachment settled in. It was like watching a stranger play the role of my wife, someone trying too hard to convince me that everything was normal. And I'd become a stranger too, pretending to be the doting husband while plotting my next move. I decided to keep things quiet. I wouldn't confront her yet. No, I would give her all the freedom she needed, and I'd keep digging, gathering every bit of information I could find. I wanted a story with no missing pieces, evidence she couldn't wriggle her way out of. I was determined to watch her crumble under the weight of her own lies. It wasn't long before the pieces started coming together. One evening, as she sat across from me at the dinner table, I noticed her glancing down at her phone, a small smile flickering across her face before she caught herself. She quickly set the phone down, but not before I caught a glimpse of the screen. There was a name I didn't recognize, JT, a man's name, based on the messages. She tried to angle the phone away from me, but she couldn't quite hide the affectionate tone in her messages, each line littered with exclamation points and phrases like, "Can't wait to see you." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to keep eating as if I hadn't seen a thing. I didn't say a word, didn't raise an eyebrow. But that night, after she'd gone to bed, I found myself standing in the dark hallway outside our bedroom, staring at her purse lying on the floor next to her closet. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and reached down. Her phone was right there in the side pocket, locked as usual, but her purse contained enough clues on its own. I found another receipt from a different restaurant, dated the previous week, with 2 entrees and 2 glasses of wine. I slipped it back in, knowing I had all the proof I needed that she'd been out with someone else. The next few days followed the same pattern. She'd leave in the evenings, saying she was going to the gym or meeting friends, and each time I'd watch her go with a quiet satisfaction. Every lie she told was another confirmation that I was doing the right thing. I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of power, a thrill that came from knowing something she didn't know. I decided to take it a step further. I hired a private investigator, an old friend who'd left the police force a few years back and had taken up freelance work. He'd helped me with a few cases in the past, and I trusted him to be discreet. I gave him Emma's schedule, or what I knew of it, and told him I wanted every detail, where she went, who she met, how long she stayed. If she was seeing someone else, he'd find out. It didn't take long. Within a week, he had photos. There she was, laughing with another man at a cafe, I'd never heard her mention, sitting close, leaning into him. The man was younger, well-dressed, with a certain confidence in his posture that made me grit my teeth. They looked like a couple on a date, perfectly at ease, oblivious to the world around them. It was like watching a bad movie, one where the characters made you sick to your stomach. Only this time, I couldn't turn it off. My investigator handed me a manila envelope with everything he'd found. Photos, locations, dates. He even managed to get her lover's name, Josh Turner, or JT, as she had saved him in her phone. He'd been around for months, and they'd made no effort to hide it. The next evening, she came home later than usual, claiming her car had broken down. She was all flustered, her story rushed, every word spilling out too quickly. She said she'd called a mechanic and waited for hours, but something about her tone felt forced. Her hair was perfectly in place, her makeup fresh, as if she'd just come from a fancy dinner, not from waiting on the side of the road. I asked her a few questions, pretending to be concerned, but every answer made me more certain. She was so far gone in her lies that she didn't even see the trap I was laying out, didn't notice the questions I was carefully phrasing to test her story. She simply went on, piling on lie after lie, completely unaware that her game was nearly over. When she excused herself to shower, I looked through her phone once more. This time, I noticed her call history, a call from JT just an hour before she came home, with a length of about 20 minutes. So much for the car breaking down. As I closed her phone, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The puzzle was complete. I had everything I needed. It was time to stop hiding in the shadows. She wanted freedom? I'd give her that, but not without her knowing exactly what she'd lost in the process. That night, I lay awake, thinking of how best to proceed. A simple confrontation wouldn't be enough. Emma was too slippery for that. She'd talk her way out of it, spin some elaborate story, and then play the victim if I let her. No, I needed something solid, something undeniable. A public, controlled revelation that would let her feel the weight of her betrayal. The next day, I took the manila envelope to my attorney. I explained the situation, laid out my intentions, and requested the start of divorce proceedings. We'd signed a prenuptial agreement when we got married, a simple document to protect my assets, but it had one clause I'd insisted on. Infidelity meant forfeiture. If she wanted out, she'd leave with nothing. The attorney assured me the case was airtight. With the evidence I'd collected, Emma wouldn't have a leg to stand on. The prenup was ironclad, and I had enough to prove her guilt beyond question. There would be no delays, no bargaining. Just the clean, brutal end of everything she'd taken for granted. I decided to wait, giving her a few days to go about her life, letting her think she'd won. I watched her play out her routine, her little deceptions, each lie told with the same practiced ease. She still had that smug look in her eyes, the one that told me she thought I'd never figure it out. And as I watched her, I felt nothing. Not anger, not hurt, just a cold, quiet resolve. She'd made her choice, and soon, she'd see what that choice would cost her. I waited for the weekend. For a day, I knew Emma would be out with friends, at one of her usual spots. This was my chance to quietly set everything in motion. I called my lawyer to finalize the divorce filing and ensured that every detail was airtight. My mind was calm, focused, as I went through each step. The years of hard work I'd poured into my career had prepared me for this. A methodical approach, patience, and a level head. Once the papers were filed, I arranged to have the manila envelope delivered directly to her in person. I wasn't about to leave any room for confusion or delay. She'd receive the envelope in a public space, a place where she couldn't hide, couldn't play her usual games. I wanted her to feel exposed, trapped by her own actions. That Saturday morning, as she was getting ready to go out, she kissed me goodbye in the same way she had for months now, a quick, distracted peck, as if she were in a hurry to get away. I watched her walk out the door with a mixture of cold satisfaction and quiet sadness. She had no idea what was waiting for her. Later, my lawyer confirmed that the envelope had been delivered to her at the cafe. She'd open it right there, in front of everyone, flipping through the photos and paperwork. According to my lawyer, she'd looked around in shock, face flushed, her hands shaking. People at nearby tables noticed her reaction. her visible distress as she realized what the envelope contained. The divorce papers, the evidence of her infidelity, the consequences of her actions in black and white. I imagined her face as she'd read the clause in our prenuptial agreement, the one she must have long forgotten about, the clause that stipulated she'd forfeit everything in the case of adultery. There'd be no settlement, no support, nothing. I imagined the weight of her choices crashing down on her, the realization that all her plans and lies had come to this. When she returned home that afternoon, she was pale, her usual composure shattered. She avoided eye contact, fumbling as she set down her purse and tried to steady herself. "Michael, we need to talk," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked up, keeping my expression blank, the same way I might at a client who'd crossed a line. "About what, Emma?" She hesitated, searching for words. I could tell she was still trying to put together a defense, some way to explain it all away, to make me the one who'd misunderstood. But there was no hiding from the truth now. I made a mistake," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Michael, I can explain. I know it looks bad, but it wasn't what you think." I almost laughed at that. It wasn't what I thought? I had photos, timestamps, conversations. I had a report detailing her every movement over the past few months, clear as day. "Really?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "So tell me, Emma, what exactly was it? If it wasn't what I think." She flinched, knowing she had no answer. But she kept trying, desperate now. "It was a mistake. I was confused. We've been distant lately, and I felt alone. It didn't mean anything." The words were hollow, flimsy excuses thrown together at the last minute. She looked at me, searching for a reaction, for some sign that I might forgive her, that I'd play the role of the understanding husband one last time. I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. "It didn't mean anything?" I repeated slowly. "You call months of lies, secret meetings, and sneaking around nothing?" "Please, Michael," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. I love you. You have to believe me. I never wanted to hurt you." But the words fell flat. I'd heard enough lies to recognize them, and each one only deepened the cold distance between us. This was no longer my wife standing in front of me. She was a stranger, a person I no longer recognized. "You didn't want to hurt me?" I asked, my voice level. "You think it doesn't hurt to find out like this? After everything we've built, after everything we've shared? You think it's that easy to erase months of betrayal?" She took a step toward me, reaching out as if to close the gap between us. "I'll do anything, Michael," she pleaded. "I'll go to counseling. I'll cut off all contact with him. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Please, just give me one more chance." I stood up, taking a deep breath, the finality of it all sinking in. "Emma," I said, keeping my tone firm, "it's over. You made your choice, and now you'll have to live with it. I've already filed the papers. There's nothing left to discuss." Her face went pale as she processed my words, the reality of the situation finally settling in. She opened her mouth to argue, to plead, but no words came out. She looked down, her shoulders slumping, the fight draining out of her. This can't be happening," she whispered, almost to herself. "I can't lose everything. Michael, please." I stayed silent, letting her words hang in the air. I didn't feel anger, not even satisfaction, just an empty calm, a relief that I'd severed the tie that had once held us together. She'd made her choice long ago, and now she was seeing the true cost. Eventually, she retreated to the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. I heard her sobbing quietly, but I didn't follow. I sat down, letting the silence fill the house, a reminder of the life I was leaving behind. The next few weeks passed quietly. I left the house and moved into a temporary place, leaving her to pack her things and figure out her next steps. Our lawyers handled the proceedings, and every communication from her side was filled with desperate pleas, last-ditch efforts to salvage something from the wreckage. But I didn't respond. I'd given her all the answers I had, and there was nothing more to say. The court proceedings were swift. The evidence was clear, the prenuptial agreement ironclad. She tried every tactic, appeals, letters, even reaching out to our mutual friends to speak on her behalf. But the facts were undeniable. and the judge ruled in my favor. In the end, she left with almost nothing, a symbolic settlement that reflected the value of what she'd done. After the divorce was finalized, I packed up my belongings and closed the chapter for good. I watched her struggle from a distance, friends turning their backs, rumors spreading about what had really happened. She became isolated, a shadow of the person she'd once been, burdened by the choices she'd made. For my part, I found peace in the quiet. I traded in a life of deception for one of honesty, rebuilding myself from the ground up with no illusions left. The life I'd once imagined with her was gone, replaced by something simpler, something real. And though part of me still felt the ache of betrayal, I knew I'd made the right choice. Because in the end, a man deserves to live his life without the weight of someone else's lies. After the papers were signed and the house was cleared, I felt a strange mix of freedom and loss. There was relief, sure, but also a lingering emptiness that came from cutting ties with the life I'd spent years building. The marriage, the home, the dreams gone. But I knew I couldn't stay wrapped up in the past. It was time to rebuild, to start over without the weight of lies hanging over me. I'd always wanted a simpler life, away from the constant buzz of the city and the demands of my career. The idea had lingered in the back of my mind for years, and now, with a clean slate, I could make it happen. I found myself drawn to an old farm on the outskirts of town, a quiet place with acres of land, surrounded by open sky and fields stretching as far as I could see. The farm had a modest house, a barn, and just enough land to keep me busy. It was a world apart from the life I'd known, but somehow it felt right. Over the next few months, I settled into the rhythms of farm life. It was peaceful, almost meditative. Each day had a purpose, simple tasks that kept my hands busy and my mind clear. I learned how to tend to the land, planted vegetables, repaired fences, and worked on the house. Slowly, the ache of betrayal faded, replaced by the satisfaction of watching my own hard work take root and grow. The locals were welcoming, in their quiet way. They'd wave as they passed by, sometimes stopping to chat about the weather or offer advice on running a farm. Before long, I was no longer an outsider. I'd become part of their community, respected for the same dedication and work ethic I'd brought to my career in the city. Only now, there were no deadlines, no backstabbing colleagues, no rivalries, just honest work and good people. One evening, I was sitting on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon when I heard footsteps coming up the gravel path. It was Anna and Grace, two sisters from a neighboring farm who had become my closest friends since I'd moved out here. They were kind, down-to-earth women who treated life with a quiet wisdom that came from years of hard work and simple living. They brought over a basket of fresh-baked bread and some preserves as a housewarming gift. We sat on the porch, talking until the stars came out, sharing stories about our lives and laughing at the small, funny details of everyday life. It was a refreshing change, honest conversations, genuine laughter, free of the pretense and performance I'd grown so used to. As the weeks went by, Anna and Grace became regular visitors. They'd stop by with vegetables from their garden or bring a thermos of coffee to share while we sat by the fields. We'd talk about everything and nothing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of ease. Their company was simple, comforting, and without expectation. They understood the quiet that comes after pain, and they didn't try to fill it with empty words. One afternoon, as we were harvesting tomatoes from the garden, Grace turned to me, wiping a bit of dirt off her cheek. "You seem lighter, you know," she said, her voice soft, like a weight's been lifted. I nodded, feeling a pang of gratitude. "I think it has," I replied. I didn't realize how much I was carrying until it was gone. Anna, who had been listening quietly, smiled. "Out here, life's simple. It doesn't ask too much of you, just that you give it your best." In that moment, I realized how much I'd changed. The bitterness, the anger, the resentment, it had all faded into the background, replaced by something steadier, a quiet strength I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't the man who'd been betrayed anymore. I was someone new, someone who had found peace in the simplicity of hard work and good company. As the seasons changed, so did I. The farm flourished, and with it, so did I. The routines, the rhythm of life. It grounded me, gave me a purpose that went beyond any success I'd ever achieved in the city. And in those quiet moments, with the warm evening breeze on my face and the soft laughter of Anna and Grace nearby, I realized I'd found something Emma could never have given me. Peace, real and enduring. The farm became my sanctuary, a place where I could live on my own terms, free from the expectations and betrayals of my past life. I didn't think much about Emma anymore, but when I did, it was with a strange sense of detachment. I no longer cared about the lies or the hurt. I'd made my peace with it, and I knew I was better off. The farm became my new beginning, a life I could shape and grow with my own hands. And though I still carried the scars of betrayal, they no longer defined me. I had a future again, one built on honesty, friendship, and the quiet strength of a life lived on my own terms. As the months turned into years, my life took on a steady rhythm. I found myself waking with the sunrise, feeling a quiet satisfaction in knowing that each day held a purpose. No grand ambitions, no boardroom rivalries, just the simple, honest work of building a life from the ground up. Anna and Grace remained constants in my world. They dropped by on evenings after their own farm work was done, sometimes bringing homemade meals or just joining me for a walk around the property. They were good, solid people, the kind who treated life with respect and never took anything for granted. Their companionship became something I looked forward to, a reminder of what I'd been missing all those years I'd spent in the fast-paced world of brokerage and business. One chilly autumn evening, as we sat around a small bonfire in my backyard, Anna looked over at me, her gaze thoughtful. "You know, you've built something beautiful here," she said, gesturing toward the fields and the quiet home behind us. "You've made a life on your own terms." Grace nodded, stoking the fire as she added, "Not everyone gets a second chance like this, Michael. To start fresh, to find peace." Their words lingered with me long after they left that evening. They were right. I'd been given a chance to rebuild, to leave behind the bitterness and hurt that Emma had left in her wake. The man I'd become out here was different, steadier, stronger in ways I hadn't realized I could be. For the first time, I felt the full weight of what I'd survived. Not just the betrayal, but the hollow ambition that had kept me locked in a life that wasn't truly my own. I was free now, and that freedom was something no one could ever take away from me. Occasionally, I'd still hear news of Emma. Rumors traveled, even to the quiet corners of the countryside. I'd heard that she struggled after the divorce, cut off from the social circles she'd once relied on. The financial settlement had left her with little, and from what I gathered, she'd distanced herself from the friends and acquaintances who might have once offered her support. She'd faded into the background, a shadow of the person she used to be, burdened by the choices she'd made and the life she'd lost. But I felt no satisfaction in hearing about her hardships. That part of my life was over, and I had no desire to dredge up old wounds. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. In the end, that was enough. As the seasons passed, my farm continued to grow. The fields flourished under my care, and I expanded, adding new crops, investing in more land. The work was endless, but there was a calm, purposeful joy in it. It was a life I could trust, one built from the ground up with no room for deception or betrayal. One bright spring morning, as I was mending a fence along the far edge of the property, Grace joined me. We'd fallen into an easy companionship over time, and her visits had grown more frequent. She was strong, steady, and her laughter came easily, a warmth that filled the spaces Emma had once left empty. She'd become an anchor, someone who understood the value of resilience and loyalty. "Thinking about planting anything new this season?" she asked, handing me a bucket of nails. I smiled, feeling a flicker of gratitude. "Thinking about it," I replied, glancing at the land ahead of us, already planning for the next season. "Maybe something that'll last a while. I'm here for the long haul." She laughed, a sound that felt like home. "Good. This place suits you." And she was right. It did. I'd finally found where I belonged, a life built on my own terms, free from the games, the lies, the betrayals. Out here, there was only the earth, the seasons, the quiet strength that came from honest work and steady companionship. Sometimes, when I'd sit on my porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I'd think back to the life I'd once had. The betrayal that had brought me here no longer haunted me. It had simply faded into the background, like a memory from another lifetime. I'd made peace with it, a quiet acceptance that allowed me to move forward without regret. Life had given me a chance to start over, to find strength in simplicity and resilience in quiet solitude. And though the past would always be a part of me, it no longer defined me. I was no longer the man who'd been betrayed. I was the man who'd survived, who'd rebuilt his life from the ashes, who'd found peace in a place where trust wasn't something you had to question. As I stood there, breathing in the fresh evening air, I felt a calm settle over me. This was my life now, and it was a good one. One that I could trust, one that was mine alone. And that was enough.